Okay, so now go back into your level, and on the left hand side here, go ahead and type enemy, and you should see enemy spawner2.tscn or enemy spawner.tscn if that's what you called yours. Go ahead and drag that out into the world, and you can see that I've got this giant hoop. Don't worry about it. For some reason, it thinks it's instancing a sprite. So anyways, just go ahead and leave that scene there, and you can see that it's already set to spawn in a Spike Man. But if you wanted to spawn something else, you totally could by dragging a different one in here. Alright, and right now it's automatically set to only 1 second. Now I'm going to show you how we can make that variable too. But let's go ahead and try this out. And we should see enemies dropping out of the spawner. Alright, so that's pretty cool. It's doing it forever. It never stops because we have a few more things that we need to add now. I've added another thing here where if you kill the enemies, they drop a coin. So right now we'll just super crouch and we can get all the coins in the world, and the rock thrower is going to trap that guy. So you can see there's a lot of strange things that start happening. If you add all of these things together, the level starts acting in a really dynamic way. Alright, so we've seen that the enemy spawner 2 kind of works. It adds guys to it. Now we need to be able to change the amount that it's going to add to the world, and also the time in between adding enemies into the world. So let's go back into our timer. We'll go back into our script, and those were the two things that we care about, were the time and we're going to go ahead and set that by default to 1, and we care about the number of enemies, and we're just going to set that to 0 by default. Okay, now in our ready script here, we're going to say get node spawn timer dot set wait time, and we're going to set it to timeout. So what that did is it takes whatever value we put into timeout and it assigns it to the wait time for the timer. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to say this number of enemies. Alright, now how do we work with the number of enemies? I'm going to get rid of this pass value because we don't need it now. We've added some real code already. So here, every time we time out, we're going to say if enemies is larger than 0, then we're going to do something. We're going to go ahead and spawn. How do we make sure that enemies goes down is we're going to say at the end of this, we're going to say enemies minus equals 1. So what's going to happen now is if, let's say this started out as 2, then the first time we come through, 2 is bigger than 0, so it's going to go ahead and do this. When it gets to the bottom, enemies decreases by 1, so it becomes 1. So the next time it gets called, it's 1. 1 is bigger than 0, so it calls it, decreases by 1, it becomes 0. Next time it calls it, it's empty. So when that happens, we can then say it'll no longer add enemies into the world. It's still going to be timing out, but it's not going to be adding enemies into the world. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and save that change to our script. And if we then go back to our level and we select enemy spawner 2 under the script variables here, you now see there's a timeout. So let's set that to 3. And let's set the enemies to 5. I only wanted to add 5 enemies. I'm going to get rid of the other enemy spawner because we've added our own now, and it's new and improved. And I'm just going to leave the rock launcher because strange things happen. So okay, so let's go ahead and try running that and see what happens. Well, first of all, I didn't run my level. So we're going to go ahead and try running that and see what happens. There we go. So we were adding enemies. We've added 1, 2, and I died, so I didn't test that very well. Let's just watch them this time. There's 1, 2, I feel like Sesame Street here, 3, 4 enemies, 5. Alright, and that's what we set it to, so it is done. No more enemies are being added to the scene, and it added them at our interval that we set. So this is working well. Okay, we've now created an enemy spawner using instancing. So right now we've already covered all the things that we were going to kind of cover in this video, which was timers and instancing. But real quick, I'm not going to go into details here, but I'm going to look at the rock and show you what's different about that rock from the ones that we've looked at before. You may notice if you open up the rock.tscn and you look at this icon here, it's a little beach ball, and that's because it's a rigid body 2D. So all of its behaviors are already kind of accounted for by the physics engine. You don't have to hard code in gravity and stuff like that. This thing's already going to fall, it's going to bump into things, it's going to figure out how it needs to spin in order to move in a natural way. So this one actually makes your life a lot simpler. It makes it a little bit harder to control a character, although you can make ways to do that too. But it works really great for things like a rock that you want to throw into the world, or anything else, because you can just set its velocity and it figures out the rest for you. So all it is a sprite and a collision shape so that it can collide with something, and it's a rigid body 2D. The script in here is empty, as you see. So there's no script controlling the performance of the rock, and yet you saw that the rocks fly out and they fall down and they move around, and that's all done with the physics engine. So that's kind of handy. Alright, and the way that the cactus adds speed to it, this is going to look exactly this, well, very similar to our enemy spawner. First, we create a new rock with rock.instance. Then we set the position to the cactus's position, right? And then we figured out, I called it LV, that stands for linear velocity, but we figure out the linear velocity, and this is hard-coded in right now, and that's not the best way to do it, but actually I'm not even using linear velocity in the example here, so let's not even worry about that. So look at line 17 in your code, and it says new rock.set linear velocity, and here I create a new vector, and if this doesn't make sense, that's okay. We can go over this at a later time, or you can hit me up in Slack and I'll answer questions regarding it. But there's a vector 2 which holds an x and a y value, and it's used to tell it which direction and speed this rock is moving in. So here we're setting this speed, this rand range speed for the x value is between 0 and your top speed for your rock. And the y value for that vector is set to y. And then we rotate this vector by a random range between -45 and 45. So what this is doing, this degree to radians, because rotated takes a thing called radians, which is another way of describing angle versus degrees. So it goes from 0 to 2 pi versus 0 to 360. And so I use this function to convert degrees, because it's easier to think in degrees sometimes, and then I pass that into rotated here. So that's why I didn't really want to get into the way the rock launcher was working, because there's some math and stuff in here to figure out how to launch that rock. So the angular velocity on the rock is telling that rock, is it spinning or not, and it spins at a rate of 0.25 to 5. I just kind of arbitrarily chose those numbers. And then the next one is get parent.addChild new rock. So then that adds the rock into the scene, and it will be moving at the speed that we set here. It'll be spinning at the speed that we set here. Okay, so now we've talked about rigid body 2D, timers, and instancing. If you have any further questions, please go ahead and leave comments in the YouTube, or you can hit me up in Slack and I will answer your questions.